So in a handful of my previous videos, I've been going over all of the best delve farms in Midnight to be able to max out your delver's journey quickly, to be able to farm Valeera experience, to be able to farm undercoins, to be able to farm endgame gear within the delves. But one thing that's a through line throughout all of these different delve farms is your delve companion Valeera, because choosing the best Curios and best role for Valeera can make any delve you're doing significantly more easy, and this also changes on a spec to spec basis. So in this video, I want to go over the best Curios for Valeera and the best roles you should be using depending on what spec you're playing. Now, like with most other things in World of Warcraft, because there are so many different specs with so many different strengths and weaknesses, some of these things may not work for what you're specifically playing, or some things may work in a much less efficient way. For instance, one of the best ways to do high tier delves right now as a tank is to pull less enemies and have Valeera as a DPS so you can clear out smaller groups of enemies much more quickly. But if you're playing specific tanks and maybe you're a bit more geared and you know what you're doing in that specific delve, using Valeera as a healer and pulling much larger groups to make much better use of AoE may actually be better for that run. Test out some of these things and see how they work for whatever you're playing at the time. And I think the best place to start is Curios, because there's not a lot of them, and a good chunk of them this season are completely useless. And there's only two combat Curios I would recommend using. First off being the Porcelain Blade tip, which Valeera can just apply a debuff to enemies to make them have an increased chance to be critically hit. So this will essentially give you and Valeera a 20% increased crit chance against that specific enemy. And since she has AoE, this can be applied to multiple targets. This won't be up 100% of the time, but it's a good damage increase and it doesn't really affect anything else in a negative way. So this is just very good. If you're not comfortable with the other choice, just use this. The second choice has a pretty big downside, but a very big upside. This is Sanctum's Edict, and your companion has a chance to gain a stack of Sanctum's Blessing through combat, as well as slaying foes. Elite enemies grant 10, normal foes grant 2, and each blessing she gets will give her 1% increased damage and healing. Once she reaches 30 stacks, which would be giving her 30% increased damage and healing, she will then convert 60% of her max health into a shield and double the effect of this while this is active. But there's two big downsides to this. First off, when she converts her health into a shield, she actually loses that health. And when she's tanking, if she gets hit by a really big hit after she converts her health into shield, it could completely remove the shield, and now she's super low health. So you really have to keep an eye on her, especially if you're like a healer, because that can end up just killing her pretty easily. And the second downside is that once she converts her health into that shield, once the shield breaks, she loses all stacks of Sanctum's Edict. So she has to rebuild up the stacks. But the main reason you're using this is because Valeera's damage is absolutely absurd, especially when you get her to like level 60. And this includes all three roles. Healer obviously a lot less, but DPS and healer spec, her damage is absolutely crazy. So buffing that up even more is ridiculously strong. Those two downsides can be a pretty big hindrance. But if you don't have any issues with her dying, whether it be because you're pulling smaller groups so she really doesn't have an opportunity to die, or you're playing a healer and just keeping an eye on her health, this is going to be the best combat Curio because it just gives such a massive damage increase to Valeera that already does absurdly high damage. Now, I do think the Porcelain Blade tip is probably going to be better if you're using Valeera as a healer, because I don't think she really needs the increased healing, and I don't think she does enough damage as a healer to warrant this over you just getting the increased critical strike chance. Now, you have a few more options for utility Curios depending on how you're running through the delves. You have the Ebon Crown of Subjugation, which opening any mislaid curiosity will essentially just give you a stack of increased primary stat, up to 12 of these at a time. So essentially, any of the small little Curios you loot throughout the entirety of a delve, so the little blue bags, will give you just increased primary stat by 2% stacking up. And after you've gotten 6 of these, so you've looted 6 Curios, the primary stat is doubled. So if you're running throughout a delve and looting all of the Curios, you can end a delve with like 30% increased primary stat, which is absolutely ridiculous. And this is definitely something that I think is much better if you're doing the strat of say, playing a tank and using Valeera as a healer because you want to buff yourself up as much as possible. Then you have the main option that I would recommend for basically everything, unless you're doing something a bit more specific. This is the Mandate of Sacred Death, and at a baseline at max rank, this just gives all of yours and Valeera's attacks an 8% chance to deal some percentage of the target's max health as holy damage. Now, anytime Valeera goes and gathers something, she gives you another stack of this, which will increase the amount of damage this is dealing. So at max rank, this starts at 2% of the target's max health. If you get up to max stacks, which is 5, it'll be 10%. So if you have this maxed out, anytime it procs, it'll do 10% of the target's max health as holy damage. And obviously that could be very good on the boss of these delves. If you're doing like a tier 11 delve, if you do 10% of that boss's health, that is a lot of damage. So just getting a few procs of this on a boss will significantly increase the speed of the overall delve. But the second aspect of this is that Mandate of Sacred Death has a very small chance to execute non-boss enemies. And this execute includes everything that isn't the boss at the end of the delve. So elites, normal enemies, nemesis enemies, anything that could be considered like a mini boss, any of the rares, anything in the delve that's not the boss at the end can be executed, which just instantly kills them. You could pull a big elite that's super tanky and it will instantly kill them. And while it says it's a very small chance, you will notice this happening a bunch of times throughout the entirety of a delve run. That's generally why I'd recommend this, because if you're doing like a tier 11 delve and you pull a super tanky enemy, even if you just only executed that one elite for the entirety of the delve, this would probably be worth, on top of just being able to deal a bunch of the target's max health as holy damage on procs, which again is super good against the boss at the end. Now the final utility curio is Overflowing Void Spire. After 25 seconds of combat, party members and Valeera gain increased damage, which at max ranks is 18%, and this is both more damage and healing. This will give it to you for 35 seconds and has a 35-second cooldown. So if you're in longer fights, say you're lesser geared and you don't have Valeera at a higher level, this is definitely a really good option. It's just a really big damage and healing increase, which again, if you're in much longer fights because you're not as geared or progressed, this will be a really good one because this will just be procced more and more during combat. But in general, I'd recommend Mandate of Sacred Death, and I will usually be running that mixed in with Sanctum's Edicts to just give massive damage increases and chances to execute enemies. And that brings us to what role should you be running Valeera as depending on what role you're playing. Now again, depending on what spec you're specifically playing, this may change up a bit, especially if you're trying to do something different. As I mentioned, if you're say playing a tank, you'd want to pull really big, you may want to run Valeera as a healer to be able to do that. But if you're playing a DPS, you should generally be running Valeera as a tank, and we'll go over why. If you're playing a healer, you should be running Valeera as a tank for obvious reasons. And if you're playing a tank, you should be running Valeera as a damage dealer. And if you're playing a tank using Valeera as a damage dealer, you're generally not going to be doing as big of pulls as you could if you're running her as a healer. That will generally be faster though, because Valeera as a DPS is absolutely crazy, especially with some of the abilities she has that we'll go over. But again, if you're trying to pull much bigger as a tank, maybe you're a bit more geared or you're playing a specific tank that has really good AoE damage, you may want to run a tank, pull bigger, and use Valeera as a healer so she can just keep you alive through these bigger heals. But in general, I think that's the best options. So let's start off with the tank version of Valeera, which if you're a DPS or healer, you should be using her as. Now, the main reason you can actually use Valeera as a tank when you're DPS in Season 1, which is very different from the War Within with Bran, is because she has an ability called Scar of Catherinetir, which causes attacks to deal 20% less damage to Valeera, and any damage reduced in this way converts that damage into a damage over time on Valeera over 10 seconds. And while this is happening, Valeera has a chance to spawn what's essentially like a ghostly version of herself that just stands there and is connected to Valeera. Now, if you damage that ghost of Valeera, it will heal Valeera for percents of her max life. And more specifically, every chunk of damage Valeera's ghost takes, she will get 8% of her max life. So you can either AoE or just fully switch to that ghost, and that will heal Valeera for a ton of her max life. So the general rule of this is when you're playing a DPS, you use Valeera as a tank. You don't pull big groups of enemies, you pull smaller groups. And because you're a DPS, generally doing more damage than the other roles, obviously, and using tank Valeera, which does quite a lot of damage, you will then be killing these groups of enemies very quickly, which will make the runs be pretty fast, and you don't have to worry about aggro. Also, get used to using pings, because where you ping, Valeera will go. If you ping an area, Valeera will go there. If you ping an enemy, Valeera will go attack it. Now, it can take like a second or two for Valeera to follow attack pings, but she generally will follow that, so you can have her pull first, because these enemies hit incredibly hard, especially like white hits. So you don't want to rush into a group of enemies and get hit by all of them and take like all of your health from that. You want Valeera to go in and pull first, so just get used to pinging her to go pull enemies. And then anytime this ghost version of her spawns, you damage it to heal her. And that's really the main thing you have to know about running Valeera as a tank when you're a DPS. Because as you being a DPS, pretty much everything else she's doing is just other abilities she's doing that you don't have much interaction with. When you're running Valeera as a tank and you're playing a healer, which may be the best combination you can do here, you actually have one other thing you want to keep an eye out for, and that is Blood-Stained Blades, which is another one of her abilities, more specifically a passive. So essentially, anytime Valeera takes effective healing, you increase her damage by 8% for 8 seconds, and this stacks, and it goes up to 12 stacks, right under 100% damage increase. Now, these stacks don't refresh the duration, so if you give her a stack of this, that stack will always end after 8 seconds. You can't refresh the duration on that. And not everything is considered an effective heal. Like, heals over time don't always count as this, but I think sometimes they do. Some more AoE focused heals will count sometimes but don't. And some healers are going to have a much easier time keeping this up. Like, for instance, Disc Priest, just keeping Atonement on her and doing your damage rotation will keep these stacks going on her quite effectively. But if you're playing like another healer, like let's say a Holy Paladin, you have to keep targeting her with heals a bit more often to keep these stacks up. And Valeera as a tank, again, actually does pretty good damage herself. So this is just giving her an absurdly high damage increase while healing her specifically. So as a healer, you're probably not going to be able to do as much damage as you could just by spam healing her to keep this damage buff active on her and keep as many stacks as this as possible. So as a healer, focus on keeping these stacks up on Valeera and letting her deal the damage. And also, depending on how geared of a healer you are, and once you know more about the delves and what enemies are super dangerous, you can pull more enemies with Valeera as a tank, but you definitely want some way to keep yourself alive or drop aggro, because she isn't necessarily the best at just running around and picking up aggro on all enemies. So if you're pulling additional things, either have ways to drop threat or have ways to group up enemies more easily, because she does have a good amount of AoE. So if you can just pull enemies next to her, her AoE will probably pull aggro off of you. But even if you're not pulling like super big pulls, playing a healer and having Valeera as a tank is the easiest way to do like tier 11 delves and is probably the fastest. Maybe tank and DPS Valeera is faster depending on how geared you are, but healer with tank Valeera is absolutely easiest way to do this. Even if you're a super under geared healer and you're just pulling small groups of enemies, Valeera is still going to do crazy damage and you'll be able to keep her alive pretty easily. Now, running Valeera as a DPS when you're a tank is for a very simple reason. She does absurdly high damage. Now, even more specifically, she also has an execute ability called Assassination. So Valeera will finish off wounded enemies, executing enemies that have less than 30% health. But this also works on bosses when they're 5% or less. Now, she won't do this to like every enemy. She won't just spam it back to back to back at all times. Sometimes she actually will. Like sometimes you'll have a big group of enemies and she'll just execute like 3 enemies in a row. So it's a little bit inconsistent if you're, say, facing one group of enemies, but as you're going pack to pack to pack, she will very consistently be executing at least something in that next pack, and she does really high damage, so you and her are going to be getting these enemies that low pretty quickly. And again, if you pull a big elite enemy in a tier 11 delve that's a ridiculous amount of health, and you both pretty quickly get it down to 30%, she'll just execute it, which is a massive time saver. Those big elite enemies are one of the largest portions of time spent in a delve, delve. So just being able to essentially remove 30% of their health is pretty massive. And again, this also works on bosses. 5% of a boss's health is pretty big as well. So being able to just lop that off is pretty nice. And outside of that, her damage is just crazy. She also has another ability called No Witnesses, where she just gives you and her a 20% haste buff for 15 seconds. And if you kill an enemy, it refreshes this. So outside of her just doing crazy damage at all times, she has an execute. She buffs you and her. So you'll just be able to kill things ridiculously fast while playing a tank with Valeera as a DPS. And again, unless you're super geared, you're going to want to do smaller pools, but those smaller pools will be killed very quickly. So this has been what's, in my opinion, the best Curios and best roles to use Valeera as, depending on what role you're playing. And using the information we went over in this video will definitely speed up your delve clears if you've been using other things. I've seen a lot of people, even some guides on YouTube, telling people to use some of these other Curios on Valeera that do pretty much absolutely nothing, because a good chunk of the Curios this season are kind of useless. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.